You may have been scolded in English composition class for writing too many passive verbs. Then, when you read scientific literature, you may have found that passive verbs were actually quite common. What's an aspiring editor to do? The answer, I think, is to seek the advice of an expert. Joseph Williams was the editor of the Chicago Manual of Style, so he knew a thing or two about words. He also wrote one of the best little books there is, I think, on writing, called Style: 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace. In it, he gives some excellent advice for choosing between active and passive verbs. First, let's remind ourselves of the differences between active and passive verbs. Notice here the style of action of active constructions in the verbs of this sentence. We expected that we would recruit the staff quickly. Now notice how different the sentence becomes when we move away from active verbs and place their action in the nouns. Our expectation was that our recruitment of the staff would be quick. Here's another sentence cast in active constructions. We investigated why the employment office interviewed so few minority applicants. And here is that same sentence revised to put the action into nouns, a process called nominalization. We began an investigation into why the employment office did so few interviews of minority applicants. And finally, notice what happens when nominalization is combined with passive constructions. An investigation was begun into why so few interviews of minority applicants was done. Certainly, you can see that such changes can take some of the life out of a sentence, and sometimes it can even hide the responsible agents of the actions of the verbs. So, is it appropriate to edit sentences for such effects? Well, here are some key questions that Williams offers us in order to decide whether active or passive verbs should be preferred. First, is the agent's identity important to the reader? Second, will active or passive verbs serve the reader's sense of coherence? Will active or passive verbs focus the reader's attention on a consistent sequence of ideas? Will active or passive verbs maintain for the reader a consistent narrative point of view? And finally, does the text need to appear objective to the reader? Notice the consistent regard in these questions for the reader. Back to the first question, is the agent's identity important to the reader? Well, here are some sentences where the answer is probably no. The president was rumored to have considered resigning. Notice how some actions are by definition impossible to assign agency. Those who are found guilty can be fined. Notice that some actions imply their agency. Valuable records should always be kept in a fireproof safe. This, I think, illustrates that some actions need no identification of agency. With regard to the next question, will active or passive verbs serve the reader's sense of coherence? Again, I think some examples will give us the answer. This passage, for instance, we must decide whether to focus on improving education in the sciences alone or to attempt to raise the level of education across the curriculum. The weight given to two factors, industrial competitiveness and the value we attach to the liberal arts, will influence this decision. Now, these sentences don't seem related until the last word of the second sentence. It starts out by talking about we must decide, and ends with the word decision. But notice what happens when we revise the second sentence, like this. This decision will be influenced by the weight we give to two factors, industrial competitiveness and the value we attach to the liberal arts. These sentences now seem related because the verb of the first sentence is nominalized in the subject of the second. With respect to this question, will active or passive verbs focus the reader's attention on a consistent sequence of ideas? Have a look at this sequence. It was found that data about resources allocated to the states were not obtained. This action is needed so that it can be determined how resources can be redirected when conditions change. The sufficient support must be provided to the agency so that data on fuel consumption may be gathered on a regular basis. These sentences seem disjointed because the subjects of their key clauses are variously data, action, and support. But notice what happens when we revise. We found that the Department of Energy did not obtain data about resources that federal offices were allocating to the states. The agency needs these data so that it can determine how to redirect when conditions change. The Energy Secretary must be provided with support so that her office can gather data on fuel consumption on a regular basis. These sentences now seem coherent because the subjects of their key clauses are consistently focused on the same concept through the nouns Department of Energy, Agency, and Energy Secretary. With respect to this sentence, will active or passive verbs maintain for the reader a consistent narrative point of view? Consider this paragraph. By early 1945, the Allies had essentially defeated the Axis nations. All that remained was a bloody battle. American, French, and British forces had breached German borders and were bombing Germany and Japan around the clock. But they had not yet so devastated either country as to destroy its ability to resist. This paragraph maintains a consistent point of view through active verbs: had defeated, had breached, and had yet not devastated. But notice what happens in this revision. By early 1945, the Axis nations had been essentially defeated by the Allies. All that remained was a bloody climax. The German borders had been breached by American, French, and British forces. Both Germany and Japan were both being bombed around the clock. But neither country had been so devastated that it could not resist. This paragraph is also coherent and has a consistent point of view because of passive verbs. But notice how now it's told from a different point of view, that is to say, the Axis nations. Finally, with respect to this question, does the text need to appear objective to the reader? Consider these examples. Here we have first-person active constructions that are appropriate for making general statements. We have investigated, we have studied. But they are not appropriate for making specific statements like this one. For such specific statements, passive constructions that are impersonal are preferred. So with these questions that we have from Williams, we can make effective choices about active and passive verbs.